So hello everyone. I know some of you, so it's always nice to see familiar places, but also new faces. I think that's what I missed probably the most about the in-person meeting. Just not only saying hi to people I know, but meeting new folks. So hopefully we have a chance soon to get together and do this. So my name is Itzhak Yanovitzky. I'm a professor at the School of Communication Information Rutgers University. And I'm a two-time grantee from the William T. Grant. So our first project focused on looking at how evidence was used in the context of federal policy regarding childhood obesity. So, we're tracking how use of research evidence took place in that context. And it was a mixed method approach, and I'll elaborate a little bit about that, but it was also very heavily dependent on document analysis. That's where we got started with document analysis. In our current project, Project Aspen, we are also using heavily document analysis. We actually expanded the use of document analysis in this context. And we're focusing on state policy making. So we have a really nice comparison between the two. And this project now is halfway through and on time, I'm happy to report. Thanks to in part to Calandra, who you see there, who is our postdoc on that project, and you get to know her a little bit later because she's going to take over for me and have a chance to introduce herself properly. So I'm going to jump right in, and just for housekeeping purposes, I'll be sharing my screen, but if you have any questions as I go, just put them in the chat. And I'm going to take pauses from time to time just to see if you have any questions and open the mic. And Callie will monitor that for me and see if there's any questions you may have. Just before we jump in, and I'm hoping that you can see my screen right now, but you have some resources that we uploaded for you guys. These are attached to the agenda, and what you have there, you have a copy of a code book that we used in a previous project, and it's a very detailed one. You will notice that we describe the methodology that we use, the logic behind it, the theory that informed the development of the code book. And we have also, in addition to the code book, we have a sample of document that's annotated. So you can see how we took the different codes that are in the code book and how we applied them in a particular kind of document. That particular document, that annotated document, is something we actually use as a good practice, so best practice, in terms of training coders. So we have extensive training of coders when we train them on a task on the use of Codebook. And we go through that process where we provide face-to-face training, virtual training as of late, and we also provide them some examples. So they use this example. So we're happy to share this with you guys, and we hope you find it useful. Also, I uploaded a copy of a piece that I published with Matt Weber, who's the co-PI on this project, from Evidence and Policy, that described the methodology. So that piece is not everybody subscribed to Evidence and Policy. I know I see Max is on it. So their team had a problem getting this. So we're happy to offer that for you guys and make it easier to access. Now, in addition to that, you have a link to a Google document there where Callie included some other type of information for you. So there's a second part of the presentation will be there. And now, I'm sorry, I'm just checking. I forgot to record, but it looks like it is recorded. So thank you, Alicia. Sometimes I forget. So I want to just point out that these resources are there, and you're welcome to use them. The news analysis is still, it's in work in progress. So we want to share that with you now, so you can see the challenges of actually applying this. So I'm going to jump ahead and start by talking about the agenda for this particular presentation. So my portion of that will go through a very high-level introduction, try to situate document analysis in the context of use of research evidence research generally, and responding to Vivian, talk about the advantages and limitations of document analysis, be clear about the advantages and limitations, when it makes sense to use it, when it does not make sense to use it. I'm then going to move on and give you some sort of rather than getting into the nitty-gritty part of that, is really reviewing for you the major decisions you have to make about the methodologies in moving forward, right? We will try to make it as rigorous as possible in the same way you make decisions about your any randomized control trials, or you're making decisions about your survey research and observation protocol and so forth, document analysis need to, or we believe, should be approached with the same kind of rigor as you move forward. So my goal will be to take you to that process, and happy to answer a question. Callie, we're going to take a break, hopefully more than 5 minutes as we had last time. And then she will come in and give an actual example of how we doing coding of news. We actually doing it right now. So just like part of something that the team is doing right now. So let me start situating that in the context of use of research evidence. So again, when we talk about how we track use of research evidence, and that's really the focus is on tracking use of research evidence. So here's how you're not tracking research evidence. If you're doing some sort of citation analysis, if you picked up my citation analysis or Google Scholar or whatever you want, and looked at how many people cite me, that doesn't really represent use of research evidence, because we don't know how do people use this evidence and to what purpose. And it's nice as they cite me, but oftentimes they also misinterpret me. So it would be nice to be able to understand how they use research. So we talk about tracking use of research evidence, and we're talking about really tracking something over a process, over time, over a routine. I'm going to underscore that in a minute. Here's an older piece by Davidson Nutley, which is formative in the field, on your field, I should say. They talk about 3 ways of which you can track research evidence. One is then it's forward tracking. So the idea is that I create a document. If you attended the plenary earlier today, and my apologies again for the technology there, but the idea was to show you how we track forward a document. So some guidelines we produced. It's supposed to inform a policy. Here's some guidelines from CDC about wearing masks, and let's see how far they go in terms of actually being implemented in practice. So we can forward track from a document, in this case, to the users by looking at the way that document is appearing or surfacing in this context. You can also backward track. So we can start with an evidence that use of research evidence was used in a document and track it back to the users and see, again, where the evidence came from, what kind of evidence is being used, and answer all these kind of questions. So this is kind of more retrospective or historical analysis. And then finally, which we do in our project, and that's, as I said below, is a very common way, because a lot of what we do is case studies. It's very historical case studies. It's kind of lends itself to going back in time and see what happened. And there's advantages to that I'll explain in a minute. The third way in which you can do that, which we actually do in our study too, is that you can have an intervention. So you may recall that part of what we're trying to do with Project Aspen is to introduce a new piece of research. Research is not available yet, which we believe is important to policymakers, because it cues them about the implementation side of policy. So we provide information that's not available right now from research. And so once we introduce that, we'll be able to track it in part by looking at documents and tracking this forward. So we have both the backward and forward tracking here, in part because we have an intervention. But again, as I say here, a common way of doing that is backward tracking. The other thing I'll make a quick comment is that just like many people who do this, this is part of a mixed methods. We have a combination of methods in a project. So in addition to document analysis, we also do interviews. We also have surveys. We also have observations. So we're looking to integrate a document analysis methodology with the other research components that we have. So we make sure we're getting a bigger and richer view of what use of research evidence looks in this context. What are the advantages and limitations of document analysis? So here's some advantages that are fairly important. One, it's unobtrusive, particularly in the policy domain, when many of these documents, there's many parts of the policy process, with the exception of meetings in the White House and so forth, but there are many parts of it that are visible to the public. These are documented, there are records of this, and we can go and find these records without interviewing people and exposing ourselves to all kinds of recall errors or social desirability errors and so forth. So it's unobtrusive, it's available, and as I mentioned before, some of you jumped on the call. One of the things that was good about this is that COVID-19 did not disrupt this, because our documents are available. We can still continue that. Moving forward, there's no issue that stops us from doing this. The documents are available, okay? The other thing that it allows us to do is to collect really rich data on many, many different aspects of use of research evidence, and I'm going to show you that on the next slide. As I said before, the goal is to try and track use of research evidence. And when we talk about tracking, we talk about two things in particular. We talk about a process. Decision making is a process. It's not a binary decision, yes or no. It's a process. And so we need to understand how research evidence plays a role throughout that process. It might be the policy making process. So we need to respect that process, or the process of adopting a new innovation in school. We need to respect that process. Almost never a single decision by a single person. It involves many, many other people. So we're trying to track that process. Another thing we're trying to track is also routines, because people have routines around use of research evidence. As scientists, we have routine around use of research evidence, and it's a fairly established routine. Oftentimes, we expect other people to have the same routine, and the truth is they don't. And so one of the things we try to do is understand how people, by routine we mean how they get research evidence, how they interpret research evidence, how they use research evidence. And so we try to map it, and policymakers is a different set of routines around use of research evidence than would teachers or nurses or doctors. And so it's really important to map that routine, not only to understand the process of use of research evidence, but also if I'm trying to intervene in that process, I'm trying to improve use of research evidence, I need to know something about the process of the routine. So I need to be able to target exactly where I want to put my research evidence in a way that will increase the likelihood of that being used, okay? In the example I just gave early on in the plenary, right now in New Jersey, both Assembly and Senate passed the legislation about mandatory screening for youth. It just stuck. The governor will not sign it because there's a lot of ambiguity around schools and budgets and potential stigma and everything else I mentioned. So by producing this evidence right now, we're gonna try and get it unstuck and use that. But that means we understand what the process is, we understand what the need is, and we try to tap to this need. We try to be responsive in that sense. And the other thing that we find really exciting to us from the point of view of document analysis, so a lot of what we do is driven by theory. We have a theory about the policy process and about use of research evidence, and we go out and test this theory because it's important to test theories. So that's a confirmation part of that. However, if we only focusing on confirming a theory, so same as creating a survey and including only questions that are designed to corroborate that my theory is correct, I'm not opening myself to other explanations. And sometimes when you look at a research instrument, in this case, document that was developed independent of me, I'm not the researcher who developed that. I'm just coming to the document. It allows me to discover all kinds of things that I did not expect. And that may generate questions for me that will generate use of theory. So one of the major products we got out of the first project, which was completely exploratory, was a theory of knowledge brokering. And that was designed, part of that was based on communication theory, and it was solidly grounded in that research tradition that is strongly valid and reputable, but we also added a few things. So we're helping our field change and move in that direction. So I want to point out that there's a nice sweet spot that's a balance between confirmation and discovery. Where the limitation, your document analysis is only as good as documents you have. So if you cannot get access to certain documents that are really critical, then clearly you cannot analyze them. So, some procedures, some discussions are not publicly available. Again, the kind of backroom dealings that happens where you don't have a document there that you can analyze, and it might be that particular conversation has been very important. That's exactly why we use mixed methods, because if you don't have that document, you can compensate for that by looking at another kind of methodology. The other reason is that it helps to contextualize certain things. The example I just gave in the last workshop was when we were looking at what kind of research evidence is being used at different parts of the process from agenda setting when a bill is being introduced, through the committee hearings that discuss research evidence and whether or not we should move with a certain policy, to supervision, to oversight and evaluation, and so forth. We find out the different kinds of evidence are being used in different contexts. And scientists were not there in the room typically when there was questions about implementation. So if we want to change the nutrition in school, what is the implication of school cafeteria? What are the implications on farmers? Well, farmers were there and school cafeteria managers were there, but there were no scientists. And when we try to understand that, we interview policymakers and ask, how can you explain that? Just say, well, you guys are not generating research on this stuff. So I have to depend on other people. That's led to this project and this notion about focusing on research that's relevant to implementation, not to the problem not the solution, but how to implement a solution that's really relevant. So I want to point that out. And of course, because you're using documents somebody else produced, it's always open to interpretation bias. You want to be careful about that. And that's part of why we're assessing interquarter reliability and some other ways to measuring, capturing that component. So what can you get from documents? Tons of things, okay? You can get a lot of information about who, the actors, who's presenting evidence, whose evidence is being used, who's using evidence. All that stuff is appearing in documents. You can also look at relationships between actors. So if you and I co-sponsor legislation, I know Max has been looking at that as well. If you're co-sponsoring many legislation, pieces of legislation together, I'm going to see that in the document because it's going to state on the top who the co-sponsors of the bills are. And I can use it to build a network analysis later and see who's connected to what kind of evidence. So I can create a network around a piece of evidence, that's a guidelines, but I can also create a network of individuals who tend to exchange a lot of evidence between them. And so all of that can be extracted from documents because I have that record there. I also can extract information about the what kind of research evidence is being used, what type of research evidence, who's producing this research evidence, what is the quality of research evidence being produced. There's all kinds of ways I can extract this information from there. Timing, again, in terms of just generally time, in terms of temporal order, what came before what, if that's important for me to establish. For example, one of the things we do in our project this time around is we want to go back, or we decided to go back to year 2000 because we want to try and capture two different administrations, the Christie administration and the Murphy administration. These are radically different administrations, and see whether there was a change in use of research evidence in this administration regarding this particular topic, because that's what policy window opens when the administration change. So we want to make sure that we capture that in terms of a document analysis so we can draw conclusions about that. In the previous project, we looked at tactical use or political use of information. Not surprisingly, we found out that during the first 2 years, after the first 2 years of Obama administration, that's where we started to get very political in Congress and use evidence primarily for political reasons. And so we clearly map that out and show how it changes over time as a way of contextualizing use of research evidence within that institution. So that's what I mean by timing. How and for what purpose? Okay, so all of you, I think, or many of you at least, are familiar with Carol Weiss' instrumental, conceptual, and tactical. And you, if you're not, and you think about applying for a grant for William T., you better be familiar with that. Instrumental use talks generally about the fact that we're using research evidence directly to make decisions. So here's evidence that suggests that this solution is better than that solution, so I'm going to go with that. That's how a scientist make decisions usually. A conceptual use of research evidence talks about the fact that that piece of evidence helped me make sense of something, make me sense of a problem. Is obesity a problem of individuals who eat too much, or is it a social problem because of agricultural policy? Depending on the evidence I present to you, you may have a different understanding of the problem, a different understanding of the solution. And so conceptual use or enlightened use is another kind of use which is really common in policy. We find that is the common use in policy to understand something. And of course, you have political use of information. And that usually happens where you say that you state a conclusion and then present the evidence. So as I mentioned before, the elections were rigged, and here's my evidence for that. Okay, and so you know that that's kind of a political use. And then finally, the context in which it's being used. Again, is it policy or practice? You can start comparing across historical context, decision-making process. Let me pause a little bit because I speak fast and see if anybody has some questions quickly that they would want to ask about why document analysis in general. All right, okay. So I can move on, and again, my goal is to focus on now in that portion is what are the key decisions in terms of methodological decisions you have to make when you do document analysis, and I would argue do it well, because everybody can do document analysis. Can you do it well? Okay. And so I should say there's a long history of doing document analysis in communication research. A lot of what we do in communication research, other than experiments, is really based on document analysis. We're analyzing content of news, we're analyzing content of other documents. So So we came from communication to this. It was easier to build and scaffold, but then adapted to the case of the URE. So there's a great resources. I did it, Cal, if you can just find a link to Kripanov's book, content analysis, awesome. And then post it to the chat. That's a great book for you guys to look at that we have not shared with you yet. I talked a little bit about the project, so I'm going to move on. Again, the idea here is to produce research that is relevant to, we believe, based on interviewing policymakers, that's relevant to implementation. We've been collecting this information right now. We're getting ready to make policy briefs and using some other tools. Again, that's what's great to have Max here, but they've been doing Quorum as well to try and push this information to policymakers and see if we can make a dent in the way that they think, discuss, and decide on these kind of issues. So we're both creating the research as a component there, where we create the research, which is what we feed, and then we track whether or not that actually makes a difference. We have a partner on this project, NAMI New Jersey. So we took the knowledge broker here and we used them to develop an intervention by brokers for brokers. So they can tell us what kind of evidence will be useful, how presenting this evidence will be useful. And so we work with them to create that and move forward. And again, document analysis is one of the things we do in this project, but they all complement one another in really nice ways. So the first thing you have is to really think about planning and design. And so before you jump into documents, before you even look at what documents you have, you need to figure out what is you trying to map. And as I mentioned before, what you're trying to map is trying to map ideally a process or a routine. And you have to figure out what kind of documents would fit, will allow you to do this. So one of the things you want to try and accomplish with documents is to track different pathways to which research evidence is acquired. I'm going to give an example of Project Aspen specifically. But there's, think about a school teacher. You might have gotten the information from another teacher. You might have gotten to your professional association and got it there. It might be the superintendent or your principal who gave you the research evidence. And so how do we track all of these different pathways, and you're making sure we're not missing anything, because that's going to be important to saying something about use of research evidence. The other thing we try to do is to make sure that we understand how, again, beyond citations, how research is actually being analyzed, how research evidence is being interpreted and used. And again, we think that you can see that in communication. People communicate with evidence and communicate about evidence. So if you look at the context of communication, you get a lot of, you get the context of how evidence is being used. This is, by the way, the reason we use manual coding and not automated coding, because automated coding cannot get the context, okay? And so that's part of the reason. In the other end, if you analyzing something like Twitter feed, and you want to see how many times the word Yanovitzky is measured, which is not that many times, then you can have a crawler just pick up this kind of particular word, right? The word maybe means something, but counting words is not document analysis. Just it's really important to emphasize. The other things that I want to try and capture is assess the direct and indirect effects of research evidence. So if you remember the example I tried to show this morning, not work as well as I wanted to, but the idea was that here's a document, the guidelines, they're informing clearly legislation. We can see that policymakers use these guidelines to suggest that law should be passed in New Jersey. But then we track the other ways, right? The other inputs from different stakeholders that change the way the policy is being now discussed or considered. And so it's really important that we track the indirect way in which these inputs, research inputs, are coming into the context. So one thing is you want to make sure that you align your document analysis strategy in terms of your planning with either a process or routine that you're trying to capture that is relevant to use of research evidence. And the other one is have a clear definition of use. Okay, so what do you mean? Use of research evidence, there's no standard definition of use of research evidence. It's different for different projects, it's different for different contexts. So your definition needs to respect what use actually looks like. We believe that use is well defined according to behavior. So use is behavior. And so if we think about use of behavior, then we ask about a question about the nature of use, the scope of use, the timing, and then the context. Okay, so again, what kind of a mask am I wearing? How many times do I wear a mask? Do I wear it regularly or not? What is the timing in which I'm wearing masks? And what is the context in which I'm wearing masks? And that tells me much more about mask wearing than just asking a person, do you wear a mask or not? Okay, so it gives me that rich information. How do we do with Project Aspen? So again, we're tracking multiple pathways through which we know evidence is being brokered. And part of that is doing a pre-study. So we join the policy meetings of our partner. And we literally just sit in all of these. Now they're virtual, so it's easy to attend. And we listen. And they describe how they introduce research to policymakers. And we take note of that. And then we start tracking it. So one of them, which we discovered this time around, was the public comments. So there's a time where there's sessions open to public comments where people coming in, stakeholders with research evidence, introduce it there. And we were not aware of that happened, or there was a recording of that. There was another pathway, and I want to emphasize that it's not only documents, it's any kind of media that you can use. So one of the things that we know, hearings are very important. We knew that from our first project. The problem with hearings in New Jersey, there's no text record of these. These are video recorded. And so we had to find the video recording, and now we're in the process of transcribing these portions of the hearings that we want to analyze because that's where research evidence was there. So it doesn't have to be only documents, it can be any kind of media as long as you have the same procedure. What does it capture and so forth. Again, we extract this information from these documents, the who, what, when, and how of research evidence. And then we try to use it to assess the uptake for the same actor over time and across actors. We can make this kind of comparison at the same time with the data that we have. So we also can actually use multi-level models, those of you who like these, because actors are nested within networks and nested within organizations. We can have that level of analysis if we wanted to do that very easily with the data we collect. Let me now, one of the things I want to point out is that the example that you have, so I share with you a code book for policy documents. Callie will later on will show you how we do news documents, but we also have other things going on in terms of document analysis. We are analyzing policy statements. Some people have websites, and on this website, they have information that include evidence. So we identify the stakeholders and we analyze their websites for use of research evidence, including what is missing from their what they report. So we can inform people about what is missing in terms of research evidence that's relevant to the topic we're interested in. We also analyze websites. We approach them from the perspective of somebody who would search for information. So if you typed in right now in Google teen depression, what would come up? And we go to this website and we code them for the quality of research evidence. So we're mapping the whole information ecosystem. We're doing it with Twitter. We're doing it with news. So it's a document analysis is really encompassing many, many different pathways to which research makes its way into the policy ecosystems. And so there's more information about that in the papers that Matt Weber and I co-authored that we share with you. Let me move into the kind of decision you need to make. So the first decision was planning. Okay, what am I trying to model, and what do I want to know about research evidence? What exactly do I want to know that theoretically is important to me, or that I want to be able to make some sort of a claims? The next thing is, how do I select, or how do I sample from population? So remember, this is a population of documents. It's an infinite population many times because you don't have a sampling frame in many cases. So how do I go about and select? How do I build confidence that my methodology is valid and reliable, right? Just same as you would do with how representative your sample is from your surveys and or randomized controlled trial. So again, the first thing is to do is identify different documents that map different aspects of the process. So in the case of policy, bills represent the agenda setting part. That's where people introduce research or introduce the idea of a bill. Hearings, records of hearings represent the policy formulation. That's where these things are discussed and debated and formulated. Then you have other kinds of activities. For example, in Congress, you would have the oversight committees that are designed to look at policy. You have evaluation committees designed to evaluate it. So if you think about the policy process and map it, even though it's not linear, but if you map it as beginning with introducing a bill to a bill being enacted or legislation being enacted, you need to find documents that represent that process. The same is for practice. where's the information enter, how it's interpreted, and how it's being used. You want to try and create that documents and justify your choice. We explained that in the paper. Thank you. We explained that in the paper that the Weber and Yanovitzky and Weber paper that's available to you from the agenda. So all of that information is there. Determine what is available to you. It's not simply what documents available, but for how long they're available. So one of the reason we had to shorten the time period we originally planned for these studies because some documents were not available going back enough. Twitter certainly was not available for our first part of the project, which went back into the 90s basically. So we don't have Twitter then. So you want to try to make it comparable if that's important for you, that all data activities will be comparable in terms of the data. You want to make sure that you use that for sampling as well. We have a whole procedure we describe in that paper that I just mentioned, but also in that book that Callie shared with you, Content Analysis, in terms of how you go about validating a search query. So, you're looking for document using a search query, using something that it's intuitive to you to retrieve the data, and you don't know how well this search query would do retrieving all the relevant articles that you want a particular topic. So we describe a procedure that's used in information sciences to make sure that you're drawing a valid and reliable sample of documents from a population. And they're using something called recall and precision, which generally map into type 1 and type 2 errors, if you think about inference errors. So the same thing applies here. So it's alpha and beta, so to speak. And so I encourage you to take a look at that because, again, that'll help you to establish the fact that you had a good sample of documents and that therefore you feel confident in terms of the inference you want to draw from them. One of the things that you want to be prepared for is that you may, as you review articles, you find out there's other documents that might be relevant. So snowball sampling is very common, particularly if you want to track what seems to be seminal paper or seminal article or seminal proceedings that seem to have been really important and are cited somewhere else. If there's some sort of way of tracking them, it's worthwhile the effort to try and track them. All right, let me move into a project aspect. I actually talked about it, so I'm gonna skip it up, and Callie will talk about it. Again, in that document we share with you, there's a very detailed account of how we went through that process of developing the code book iteratively. So, we designed something based on theory and design based on something that existing instruments. You could take our document analysis instrument and use it, but I would strongly encourage you not to use it as is. Because an instrument is supposed to, again, it has to make sense in the context of that particular study. So you want to make sure that you adapt. You can take the spirit of the code book and use it in your own research in a way that you can apply that. We're going through that process again. We're developing this a priori without looking at the data. Then we exposing it to the data, and then the coders tell us that this does not make any sense, and you can see that. Callie is also going to give an example of how something that happened recently informed our edition of a code book that was really important in that context. We then provide training once we're very happy with the code book that we have. So the news coding that you see is pretty much finalized, but we might have to be tweaked. We keeping it open. The one I share with you with the policy documents from the previous project is done. So that is validated and reliable, and we feel very comfortable with it. Once we have that, we reach that step, we're training people on that. So we're training coding, the coders on making decisions. We take a sample of articles, they have them apply it, assess intercode reliability. How you assess intercode reliability, I'm going to leave it to Callie to talk to you about. But also in that book that we share with you, Content Analysis by Klaus Krippendorf, it described this whole chapter, or just how you assess intercode reliability, which is really important. The coders are your instrument. So in the way you validate your instrument, via factor analysis or whatever methods you're using, you need to do that for your coders as well. And then we do the coding. I'm going to skip that one. So we have 3 tiers of coding. We're looking at metadata for the document. We're collecting recording units on the document. We're looking at the actual level data, the who of use of research evidence. And then we have evidence level codes. We're measuring 2 components there when it comes to research evidence. So research evidence is not the same as use, in the same way that vaccines are not the same as vaccinating, okay? So we're looking for the research evidence. We're looking for these references to research evidence, and whether they are statistical facts or are they coming from government or academia or from scientists. We code for all of this, and you can do quality if you wanted to do, using sort of a benchmark for quality that you can apply. But then we're looking at the use. And in the context of policy, our use focusing on how research is being used in communication, primarily for persuading other people. Okay, so what is the goal of using research evidence? What is the nature? Is it instrumental use, conceptual use? We can see by how people interpret the research, and we can get a glimpse at that. Timing, we talked about, and then of course the context. So that's kind of more in deep. Now we think about research evidence, it plays out in communication, how people communicate about that. So we're tracking the communication to get the context in which research evidence is being used. And depending on the communication, we have codebook that describe what we're looking for, which you will have a chance to see in a minute. Last comment I'm going to make before we're going to take a break is that there's some sometimes misconception that document analysis is a qualitative methodology. It doesn't have to be. So we extract a lot of quantitative data from documents that we can use for anything from descriptive statistics, for example, comparing use of research evidence by policymakers to that of journalists, which is similar but also different in some interesting ways. We can also run cross tabs if you want to run it by different things. We can do basic hypothesis testing, and we can do even time series analysis, multi-level analysis, and network analysis. So this is quantitative data we extract from the coding that we can use just like you use the survey data or any other data you obtain from quantitative methodology. However, there's also a qualitative side to it, so we combine both. And again, the idea is to create a thematic analysis to extract things we were not, one of the things that we added this time around that did not exist before is use of research evidence to legitimize other evidence, right? And so this is fake news. Okay, so where's the evidence for that? So journalists use it routinely to suggest whether the evidence presented is legitimate or not legitimate. And so we're very interested in that kind of use of research evidence, and we included that in our coding this time around. So I'm going to pause here, and we can take, do we have time for 10 minutes, or am I way behind?
I think
we have 35 minutes. To the end of the session.
Sorry,
we have 35 minutes. We have 35 minutes total, and we did have a question, I think.
Exactly.
All right, so let's do 5 minutes. And what is the question?
So I'm the guy with the question.
Okay. Yeah.
So thanks for all of this. It's really interesting. I was wondering if you could just sort of talk a little bit more. Maybe this is going to come after the break, about the use measure, and in particular, sort of, I'm curious if you could just talk about some of your experiences training people to code for some of those things, and what has been easy, difficult, some of the challenges, things like that.
So very quickly. So as I said before, I'm going to be the one pushing that use of research evidence has to be defined in the context of the study, particularly in the process or routine you're trying to capture. So citations are never enough for me in terms of use of research evidence. This means absolutely nothing to me. In academic context as well, I should say that too, just to be fair. But the idea here is that when we approach them from the policy perspective, we believe that research evidence is only consequential or mostly consequential when it happens in the course of communication with other people about that. So you need to justify the decision. You need to be accountable for the decisions that you make. And you oftentimes use evidence, particularly in the policy domain, for that. So policy in the policy domain, the use of research evidence is very commonly happening in the context of arguments. And so if I take this argument as my unit of analysis and I break that argument and see how research evidence is weaved into this, I can get a sense of how it's being used, because the person who's communicating this evidence will interpret that for other people. Here's what this suggests, okay? And also, what are the implications, what are the solutions, and so forth. So our codebook reflects that. You guys will have a chance to look for yourself at the codebook, but we're capturing as the goal of using. What is the goal? Are you trying to persuade? Are you trying to draw awareness? Are you trying to make the case that this particular policy is useful or not? So we're breaking it down into something that makes sense in a particular context. Now, in the context of practice, it may look different. Maybe you're trying to make, if you're a doctor, you're trying to make a decision making about somebody with cancer. How do we negotiate what this MRIs or fMRIs means, okay? So you have to put in the context of the users and approach it from the perspective of the user. It always has to be audience-oriented and not research-oriented. If you want to be successful, you need to think about from the perspective of your user, not from the perspective of the research that you're using. Training, we do extensive training, so it involves anything from putting together in-person meetings, usually take about an hour to 90 minutes, where we train, we go over the code book, we explain the rationale, then we test that. We take a sample of documents and have people independently code them and see where there are some issues, provide more training. So, typically if something black on white, you're going to have a lot of agreement. It's just coming down to how it's being interpreted, where you're going to have disagreement. And that's where you want to work on in terms of training. You want to try and provide additional training on that component of the code book because it's more ambiguous. And then we continually assessing that. So we creating documents, you can see an example with what I included. We also have virtual trainings now, we're recording these so people can see when they join the project. But generally, we also, once they start doing it, we're monitoring them because it can be fatigue. And we take random sample of coding and we reassess the intercode reliability to make sure that we're getting good quality data and that there's no errors introduced. Ready for a break? Awesome. So we'll be back, I think, in 5. Okay, thank you all.
I'm going to grab some more water real quick. Be right back. Itzhak, was that the right link to the book? I sent them the Google Doc or the Google Books link.
Yeah, that's a link.
Okay, cool.
And then I guess I did not share the theory piece, so let me do that.
Cool. I did, speaking of I did email Box about that folder, and they said that maybe one of us had deleted it, but I know that I didn't.
We'll figure it out.
Yeah, that's really weird. Stresses me out, though, to think that our data could just disappear.
to go to everybody. Okay. Yeah, this is good.
What time are we starting?
I would imagine 1 minute. Thanks, Alicia.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I just quick introduction. I'm Calandra Lindstadt. I am a first-year postdoc with the Aspen Project. I completed my PhD in persuasive health communication at the University of Texas at Austin. Most of my research is mixed methods, so it's been great working with Itzhak and increasing my knowledge and understanding of these methods. As Itzhak described in his presentation, one of the primary goals of Project Aspen is to map the information ecosystem surrounding the topic of adolescent depression and suicide, and we're looking to discover the use of research evidence in this area. I've been particularly involved with collecting and assessing the news documents related to our topic, and I'm going to walk you through the process using this specific example. And I reshared the link to the code books and the sample news documents in the chat, just so you guys can look at those. So I wanted to start with a couple of quick definitions. We are examining these news articles in search of mentions of research evidence, and then we're coding how and why the evidence is being used in each instance. And research evidence includes information from descriptive studies, interventions, meta-analyses, and cost-effectiveness studies. And this definition is taken directly from the William T. Grant Foundation website, so y'all can find it there. And use of research evidence, we're looking at it as both cognitive, as in informing how policymakers' intellectual understandings around an issue. And then we're also looking at it from sort of the social use perspective, or how policymaker, or how you can use research evidence to influence others. And as Itzhak pointed out, when you're assessing an information ecosystem, you're looking at a variety of documents, and each unique group of documents requires its own code book. So the current project has a different code book for assessing the policy documents, the websites, as well as the news articles. And you can imagine why, you would need to collect different information about a website than you would about a news article. With a news article, you have information about the journalist and about the newspaper. You're not going to have a journalist on a website. So there's even just from that most basic perspective, you have very different needs for the two different types of documents. And it's also important to note that your codebook should only contain variables that are necessary to answering the research questions. Once you get into the coding process, it can be you can want to add more variables that can help the process, and you really want to resist that. You just want to keep the variables that are essential to answering the questions and instead refine your process outside of your codebook. And then, as I said before, we're trying to examine how the news functions as knowledge brokers, or maybe I didn't say that, Itzhak said it, But how the news can function as a knowledge broker through the 5 key functions that he and Weber introduced in their article. And we're looking at awareness, which is drawing attention to relevant research. The news can function by increasing accessibility or making research more digestible for decision makers. It can also function through engagement and influencing how decision makers consider and value the insights and evidence. It can function as a linkage resource where it is connecting people who are seeking the same types of solutions for the same problem. And then you finally have mobilization, where it's pushing for the available evidence to be used in policy and practice. And in order to assess this in the news, we had, and I say we very loosely, that was mostly Itzhak and Weber. I get to tack my name on the end of this one. In order to assess this, we had to operationalize each of these functions. And here you can see the various operationalizations for the functions. When we're actually looking at news documents, what are we looking for to say that this piece of evidence is increasing awareness or accessibility? And you can see for awareness, we're just counting the volume or frequency of mentions of research evidence. For accessibility, we're tracking the types of research evidence as well as the way it's being contextualized and presented to aid in understanding. For engagement, we're looking at how it's presented with a focus on a particular community, if it's being focused on a particular community, and whether or not the topic is situated within broader issues. And then for linkage, we're looking at whether or not there are references in connecting other actors, issues, or resources to the research evidence. And finally, with mobilization, we're looking at the use of the evidence in this news article, whether or not it's legitimizing claims or holding entities accountable. And getting into the codebook development, Itzhak talked about this a little bit, and you may have glanced at the 2 codebook handouts that we gave you. There are 3 levels of coding. So you have I think of it almost as meta information. You have the document level of coding, which is describing the document that contains the research evidence, right? And these documents can contain multiple mentions of research evidence. So that meta information would be the same for multiple lines of data in your code. And then you have the actor level, and this is going to be really important when you're analyzing your network later, right? So who is supplying this information? So this is you're still not assessing the evidence yet. You're looking at the individual who is supplying the evidence. And frequently with news articles, journalists do not cite their evidence the same way that scientists do. And so you have just a snapshot of a statistic and you're saying, where did this come from? Where did you get this? And in that case, we've trained our coders to go ahead and cite the journalist as the supplier. So they get included in our network. And then finally, you have the evidence level, right? So that is actually getting in and assessing that piece of evidence that's being used in the article. And Itzhak, when he talks about this, he's so brilliant that you might just assume that the code books just spring fully formed from his head like Athena from Zeus, but it's not like that. It is a very rigorous and long ongoing process that includes almost everyone who touches the code book, actually. You have the highest level, the theoretical conceptualization of this code book, and then it gets passed down to somebody like me who schleps through it and looks for inconsistencies or ways that it could be clearer. And then even after that, we're handing it to our graduate students or undergraduate students, the people who are actually going to be doing the coding. And even in that process, we're still receiving information about how we can make this code book more clear and how we can apply it more cleanly to the documents we're analyzing. So initially, once we've sort of cleaned it up and we feel pretty confident about it, we'll test it in a very small random sample of the documents. And this is just to see how it maps. We have this theoretical idea. What does it actually look like in the real world when we have a newspaper article in front of us? Are we able to capture each of the things we're looking for? And then also we're considering whether or not there might be additional information in those articles that we never even thought of. And that's a really exciting moment. Then at that point where we feel like we've refined it pretty well in that pre-test, we go ahead and provide some training to our undergrads or graduate students, whoever's doing the coding, go ahead and apply, our first round of inter-rater reliability to a random sample of these documents and line it up, see how we did. And at that point, we probably do not have reliability and have to do at least one more round. It's very rare that you nail it on the first round. But so then we would retest and reassess intercoder reliability. And this is an example of, this is a snapshot of our codebook while it was in development. And it's an example of how you get something from the real world, you get something from this application. Itzhak and I actually attended a wonderful William T. Grant event, the Proposing Studies of Strategies to Address Structural Roots of Inequality. And it was such a great presentation. We came back from it and had a meeting, and we were both just like, we have to include this in the data. We don't currently have anything capturing, the diversity, equity, access, these issues. So what we did was we sat down and decided that we would add another line for special populations, just to see, how is the news considering particular groups when it discusses adolescent depression and suicide. And so it's a perfect example of broadening your research questions based on your lived experience. This is another snapshot of our code book. And I'm going to move into the coding procedures so we can get you guys into some of the real examples. When we begin, and I'm not missing any questions. When we begin coding, we just kind of break it down really simply for our trainees. You want to look to determine whether or not the document is relevant. And then you start with the document related information and then move into the supplier and the relevant evidence coding. And so here's a quick example for you guys. Not every mention of research evidence is relevant to this study. We are specifically considering adolescent depression and suicide. And so we have to make very clear with our coders that you're not just looking for any mention of research evidence. You need to make sure that it's relevant to our research question. So here's an example of how that is different. Here's just the top one is just straight research evidence about depression. And then the bottom one is specifically including the population that we're interested in. So we would only take the bottom mention. And we're to our first example. So I have just taken an excerpt here. You have these articles in total in the sample PDF that I gave you. But this is just for time and space. I'm going to give you guys a minute to read through what I have posted here. That's all you'll need if you can read it. And see whether or not you think it's relevant, whether or not it contains at least one mention of research evidence, and whether or not the evidence pertains to our topic of interest, adolescent depression and suicide. So I'll give you guys a second. And maybe when you feel like you have an idea, you can enter yes or no, yes relevant or no not relevant into the chat. Keep it simple, just yes or no will work. That's a good question, is defining your population. And yes, in this case, we did define our population as it's 13 to 20, Itzhak, is that correct? Yeah.
Federal definition of children is up to age 21.
Anybody brave enough to take a stab? I'll just tell you, in the last session, we had yeses and nos, so. Yeah, so it looks like we have some yeses, but it's difficult. It's a difficult question. And in this case, what do we think about the blue? Is blue relevant to our study? Would we include that?
No.
Not blue. Oh, correct. Blue doesn't describe adolescents or youth in particular. However, green is absolutely an example. And you can see over on the left here, this is in red. That is the document level data that we would collect. And then we would copy the text here, the entire piece of research evidence, and we would paste that into our Excel spreadsheet because we like to have the actual mention there to go back in case something is a little hinky looking later. And it can be really helpful to be able to look at exactly what you've pulled. And then we also, of course, Itzhak is a stickler for making sure that we have the actual data. So we have all of these news articles pulled and saved in multiple locations so we can go back and check them. And then I'll just move to the next slide. So here you can see we have the supplier information. That's not on your screen in the excerpt that I pulled, but Marilyn Gold was the researcher who collected this data, and she was actually interviewed in this piece. So we have her name. It wasn't just a random mention of research evidence, which actually the death of Marilyn Monroe, we have no idea where they got that. Luckily not my problem because it's not relevant to my study. So, and then you can see in yellow, we start getting into the evidence level variables. And so we're looking at the source, where did this come from? Was it academic research? Is it a government agency like CDC? And you can look at these in more depth when you get a chance to look at the code book. But I did want to show, so I thought this one is an interesting one because it does have an example of a linkage. You have down there at the bottom, you see Stephen Stack, a professor of, I'm going to assume criminal something law maybe. But he is in here as a linkage actor accepting the evidence. He thoroughly endorses this evidence and thinks that it's quality. So he would be someone that we could then include in our network analysis of who are the people that are in the conversation, as Itzhak so beautifully puts it, in this conversation around this evidence use. And where are we for time? Because I have more examples that we could go through, but we have 10 minutes. Let's do one more if that's cool. Are you guys into it? Okay, I want to make sure you have plenty of time for questions. I think let's look at, so actually, let's look at example C, because I have this one in more detail and more depth. So this one is probably pretty hard to read on the screen, but you should have it in the PDF. Is everybody able to look at that PDF? Is anybody not? So I would suggest go and look at that PDF and give this one a quick read through.
Where's the PDF?
Oh, it's in, I'm sorry, Bill. It's in the Google Drive folder that was in the, that was linked in the chat. It should be the very last, nope, second to last link. But if you can read it on the screen.
Kelly, well, why don't we just go to the example? They can read it later because I want to make sure that.
Sure. Yeah, that's great. Okay. So in this one, you have 3 pieces of research evidence. See, I was going to quiz you guys, but Itzhak is saving you from the quiz, so everyone gets full credit. So in this one, we have three pieces of research evidence, and the green one is U.S. suicide is the 3rd most common cause of death for 15 to 19-year-olds. Although girls tend to think about, plan, and attempt suicide more, boys actually follow through at a higher rate. So this would be an example of a piece of evidence that the journalist is just supplying to us. They have not cited any source. In red, you have the piece, according to American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, 90% of suicides are a result of mental illness, such as depression. That piece we wouldn't code. We would not actually collect that because it's not explicitly referencing our population of interest. And then in blue, again, this one is really interesting, and it's the reason why I included this example. Here you have, I'll just read this out. Teen suicide prevention groups are making a difference. However, according to Ann Haas, Senior Director of Education and Prevention at the AFSP in New York, the teen groups often help peers develop better coping skills to handle emotional crises. And this was a piece that we actually started discussing. Yeah, it was something that Itzhak and Matt were already interested in, but we had to discuss it in more depth. You were talking about the process of refining the code book and where you need extra training. And this was one that was a little bit tricky because we really wanted to include experts because expert opinions are clearly influential. And these are often the people, as Itzhak said, who are describing the implementation, who are describing the actual, and you can see here the difference between the evidence in green and the evidence in blue. The evidence in blue is talking about an intervention and describing something that could actually be helpful. Whereas the evidence in green is simply, emphasizing the magnitude of the problem. And so trying to get our coders to understand when you're looking at an expert, what is the evidence that that expert is providing, and what's the difference between an expert and maybe a lay person who's just having an opinion, and how do you collect that? That actually took us some work and some refinement of the code book. And so here you can see I have pulled out, these are the two pieces that are relevant, and over on the left, or I don't know if it's left or right for you, so I should stop saying that. Over in the spreadsheet, you have in red, these are the document level variables, and you can see they're the same for both A and B because they came from the same document. And then here we would have, I was gonna step you guys through this, but I don't think I'm going to, it's too in depth, but we could go through and look at, who is the supplier, and you would see that the supplier for each of these is different. So for evidence A, it's the journalist, Valerie Menard, and for evidence B, it's actually Ann Haas. And so then you're stepping through for each of these individual pieces of evidence, they have their own line in the Excel spreadsheet, and you're going through describing the variables, examining each piece of evidence in itself and within the context of the article. So particularly for this piece of interpretation, right? You're looking at how is this piece being placed in this story. So you guys can look at the code book in more depth and see it's a little bit difficult. I really struggled with how to show and make this more interesting and interactive when code books are so complicated and there's so much to it. But hopefully that gave you guys a little bit of an overview, and we should have time for some questions. And that can be from either myself or Itzhak. Itzhak, you're muted.
Just a quick comment. When you look at again, we try to put in our code books under anticipating that other people may want to use them. We include a lot of details in them. And so one of the things you're going to see is that we make a distinction between a claim and evidence. Undergraduate coders not always know what the difference between claim and evidence is. So we include that element there. And then we're very clear, again, it's ambiguous things. For example, an expert will be treated as research evidence because you speak from your expertise. Typically when we are being called upon, we're not talking from, one would hope, talking based on body of knowledge and not their own opinions. So at least we say it's our own opinions, as opposed to somebody who clearly is articulating an opinion. The other thing I'll point out is you're going to see in the code book that in some iterations, we collected both research evidence and non-research evidence because we wanted to compare the portion of research evidence is being used. We wanted to do it particularly for Congress. And we did see, for example, that over time, the proportion of research evidence or the ratio of evidence to non-evidence has changed. There was more no evidence than evidence as we moved on closer to the 2000s, the 2020, of course, and so forth. So I just want to throw this in. So when you read the code books, there's going to be more details that is designed to help anybody who's not part of this project to understand how you make decisions.
Yeah, and that bit about the claim was actually one of the examples where we did not include coding for that in our code book, because it might have helped our coders with the process, but it's not something that we are interested in. So we did not include it, and we just made it more explicit in the process.
So there's a question here about coding policy document, particularly the linkage function. So the linkage function is about really creating connections, right? It's about, we know that policy is, particularly policy is embedded in relationships. And so the relationships can be a relationship with other actors. So you make connections to other actors through the research evidence, but for example, suggesting that here's who's supporting these guidelines by CDC, and who's, Dr. Fauci said it's working. So you want to capture that. There's also linkages to issues, which are really important, generally called framing. Slightly different in the way Cynthia presented this morning. It's not framing from the sociological perspective, it's communication perspective, which is how do you think about research evidence, okay? And one of the ways, if I took something, part of what we're going to do with this project is train people to use research better, we think. So think about the context where right now, right now it's all about COVID. Nobody's paying attention to anything else, okay? But, and before there was opioids, if you remember, opioid is still a big problem, obviously. And one of the things we want people to be able to do with research evidence to understand that even though the policymaker does not pay attention right now to depression, because the focus on opioids, if you made a link between opioids and depression and suicide, if you told them the number one cause of opioid use in adolescents and teens is depression, I made that linkage for him. So now when he thinks about depression, he thinks about opioids, okay? And that's what we're trying to do with kind of linkages, think about how we build this. And you can certainly do that with policy documents because it is a political process, because it's how you understand something as, rigged or not rigged, and all that kind of stuff, right? It's the context you put in that and how you present it that really matters. And that's what we're trying to capture. That's slightly different than mobilization, which is really putting pressure on people to act based on evidence. So the evidence is clear, masks are working. Why are we not having a mandate right now? Okay, and we want to see that that's going to come in the news and going to come in some other context. And that's what we're trying to capture, the indirect way in which research evidence is being used to accomplish the same task. So 1 minute over. So if you have one more question, we're more than happy to entertain that. So we do hope it was useful, and thank you for sticking with us throughout. And of course, if you have any questions or suggestions, or any if you have a question specifically to something you walk in, we'll do our best to help. Obviously, we want to try and make sure that this methodology is being used as widely as possible.